Welcome to Rule of Law, the first in our online series on this topic. As you know, it's very wide, and one of the things we must note at the outset is that there's more than one definition of rule of law, and there's also overlap with separate but related concepts of democracy and human rights. Why is it important? Rule of law is often used by investors and lenders to gauge whether there's a stable and predictable business environment to support an investment. It is an additional information source to purely economic ones that allows somebody on the outside to consider the degree of social development in a country, and therefore how sustainable economic investment activities may be. What is important to realize is that economic measures on their own will not provide a full picture of the investment climate. Now, there are various measures of rule of law by different organizations, and we're going to come and look at some of these in greater detail, including World Justice Project and Transparency International. Some of their methodologies rely heavily on people's perception. There may be a degree of inbuilt bias because there's a common perception that Africa is a very corrupt continent. While some of our countries may fit this profile, many do not. For example, Botswana is doing very well in rule of law, and South Africa, which on many indices has been considered one of the leading countries in Africa on rule of law, has actually in recent times fallen behind. We also know from our own experience on the continent that we're somehow surprised between comparisons between countries quite close to each other about different rankings. One of the reasons for this may be because as a country devotes a lot of time and effort into combating corruption, more incidents are being reported. But this does not necessarily mean there's actually an increase in corruption in that country. On the contrary, it may simply be because people are more attuned and aware about the issue. Now, leaving bias aside, there are clearly challenges to rule of law on the continent. Firstly, we have some historical reasons for this. Colonialism left us with a legacy of corrupt governments that lack legitimacy and rulers who don't have a lot of local support. We have poor electoral processes and outcomes, and we have the politicization of this whole discussion about rule of law by some of our African governments who are saying it is unfair to tie donor funds and loans to questions such as rule of law. On the other hand, the Chinese are lending to Africa without these so-called strings attached, and many of us are left to ask whether economic development should come first or fundamental freedoms. Whatever your views on these issues, there are a number of practical ways that you can mitigate risk from poor rule of law. Firstly, by identifying reliable data sets and comparing them with on-ground sources of information. You can do this by working with good local partners with deep knowledge to help you find practical solutions to what are often very common problems. You will need to have frank discussions with investment partners and stakeholders. Finally, in Africa, we are rich in traditional mechanisms and structures for resolving disputes. None of these should be ignored. I'd now like to invite you to turn your attention to the very strong mechanisms we have on the continent for supporting rule of law.